Oh my gosh, we're live and in the same place.
We're in the same place.
Wild.
Sometimes this happens.
Sometimes we're actually physically together.
We're actually physically together a lot. We just usually when we don't have time to also go live.
Very true. But today we crafted our day around going live. So here we are. We're going to talk a little bit about exactly what sci-fi can teach us about empathy. As our description said, we're going to get our nerd on. Both of us are certified, bona fide nerds and love various and many sci-fi properties. And we'll be talking about that. But first, obviously, we've got some empathy exercises. And so we are excited to be at our new time. Again, let us know what you think about it. Hello, replay crew, or anyone who's joining us live. So we're ready to get started. We hope you are too. All right.
Okay.
If I'm looking in the wrong place for most of this video, I apologize in advance. I've literally physically moved my camera and my muscle memory cannot seem to remember that. So I am apologizing right now, but let's get started with empathy exercises. Well, we're happy to be your lunch buddies for the day, Jay.
Yay!
And if we're anyone else's lunch buddies, obviously we'd love to know. One of the reasons we picked 1 o'clock on a Tuesday, see if some of you can join us for your lunch. So the first empathy exercise comes from me. Shocking that I am on an indigenous story. She's rubbing off on me.
My plan is working.
So this comes to us from NPR, where with the Kaw People, which they are in Kansas. He has a University of Oregon jacket on, and that keeps throwing me off every time I read this story. Yeah. Which, I mean, he's allowed to wear a different team, but obviously. So there's a huge boulder that's made of quartzite that was somewhere else it shouldn't have been, and now it's going back to tribal land. It has a really sacred meaning and sacred stone to these people, and I'm really excited it's going back to the tribal land in Kansas. This is a great kind of physical encapsulation of what Cheryl Wesley Young said in a video that's going up on the channel next week, which is that when you are using something as a non-sacred thing, but for someone else it is a sacred thing, you should consider not using it anymore. So whether that's words or giant rocks, if it's not sacred to you and it's sacred to somebody else, step out of the way.
Yeah, man.
Not hard. Second one comes, I'm glad we're finally getting data about women's bodies and the COVID vaccine. So we know that at the beginning of this all, that because they rushed trials, they didn't test anything about menstruation. Excuse me. And obviously, while they had been doing data on the vaccine family that the COVID vaccine comes from, they didn't have time to test the specific COVID vaccine on pregnant women, and there was a lot of concern around that. Well, actually, now it turns out that people with COVID vaccine, there's it cuts the risk of stillbirth. Like there's something in the vaccine that actually cuts the risk of stillbirth, which is insane.
Okay, cool.
By about 15%, they figure in these preliminary findings. It's completely safe for pregnant women and may even have additional beneficiaries. And I read in another article, this one comes to us from The Guardian, but I read in another article that there was some real benefits to mothers who choose to breastfeed as well. If they got the vaccine, there appears to be some sort of boost in antibodies. That's very, very exciting.
Cool.
So
it is.
Love it when we do medical research on all bodies and not just male ones.
What an idea. Speaking of another crazy idea, the Senate has approved Lisa Cook as the first Black woman to a federal post. And I believe she is, oh, you're crazy mouse.
I can scroll.
I got it.
Okay.
And she's in the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. which makes her the first Black woman in the 108-year history of the organization. You guys know that firsts in anything are real easy empathy exercises for us because we're all about representation here. So this is really exciting, especially because her area of interest and expertise, her career has been looking at the experiences of Black folks in this country and how they differ economically, specifically. So the economic repercussions of a lack of generational wealth, of systemic oppression and racism, all of that. So not only to have a woman who looks like them, but a woman who has studied and understands and is going to advocate for a lot of the economic repercussions and disadvantages that happen to Black and brown folks in this country because of racism. So super exciting to see that. Congratulations, Lisa. We look forward to seeing you shake things up a little bit.
And for anyone who doesn't know, who's not American, the Federal Reserve is essentially our national bank. So we don't have a national bank that like we can go take money out of. Instead, good old Alexander Hamilton set up a national bank that controls things like interest rates and how much our money is worth. And then independent banks formed from there. So we don't have like a Royal Bank of Canada, for instance. We just have the Federal Reserve, which is our national bank.
All right. Next up, back to Indian country correspondent, C'est moi. We've talked about this a lot on our channel, that the Department of the Interior, headed by the first Indigenous person ever to head the Interior,
not to be born,
Secretary Deb Haaland, has launched and is in the midst of an investigation into the relationship between United States boarding schools and residential schools and its impact on Indian country. So she made her first statement about it last week, saying that they have already documented more than 500 deaths of Indigenous children, but that is far, 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 far from over. They have a long way to go, the experts are saying. But it's important that they are finding these grave sites and starting out where they mean to go on in terms of accountability for what happened. So we're excited to see this recognition. This is the first time in U.S. history that the government has attempted to comprehensively research and acknowledge all of the horrors inflicted on Native American children for decades. So it's a huge undertaking. It's long overdue. We hope that as they continue to find these grave sites and find out and document these children and what happened to them, that it brings some measure of healing, and that the Native and Indigenous communities that are impacted and that these children came from are able to process this news in a way that is holistic for them and meaningful for them. So we'll continue to keep a weather eye on it. It was big news last week to see it come down and to be so openly acknowledging this trauma. So keep working on that report, folks. And I promise I'll read it, even if it's 300 pages.
She certainly will. So this one is just one of those, like, please remember that children are abused everywhere kind of stories. We talk a lot on this channel about abuse of females in sports. But, you know, we were not covering the world when the Jerry Sandusky scandal broke at Penn State. And so we don't talk a whole lot about abuse against boys within athletic institutions. And this was a great opportunity to do that. So Alex Harrison sued his school district for negligence after his high school tennis coach molested him. And he was awarded $10 million, but it took 12 years. Took 12 years to hold him accountable in Marin County, California, which for anyone who doesn't know is Northern California, and very, very wealthy, like in the Bay Area, Marin is. I applied for a TEDx there. And it is, he's been sentenced to 250, the coach has been sentenced for 255 years to life for molesting 2 other tennis people. So 3 boys, and he gets 255 years. Wherever there is one case of molestation, there is statistically, we know there's at least 4 to 5 more. Mm-hmm. So probably around 15 to 20 boys on some level throughout this gentleman's career were abused in some way, either physically, sexually, emotionally, however possible. So it's a big deal. We wanted also to highlight the length of time that legal justice, quote unquote, can take in sexual assault cases or any case in which the crime scene is your body. So, which is why there's a lot of conversation around going a civil route. And then what does justice mean? And what are people really looking for? And how does this all work? So this is a really great recent conversation from the New York Times, and bravo to Alex Harrison for the bravery of starting this. Glad that he had the resources, both emotionally and financially, to be able to pursue this. And we applaud the ruling that this predator is off the streets.
I couldn't think. I was trying in the last few seconds there to think of a transition. I didn't have one. It didn't come to me, folks. But this is an update for our recent discussion about the United States hitting the mark of the 1 million COVID deaths that we know of in the United States. And when we talked about it, we said heretofore, as of a week after when we were talking about it, it was a week after the mark. They had not, the U.S. government had not done anything to formally mark it. So then when this came across my newsfeed, I wanted to make sure to share it that last week, President Biden announced that all flags are to be flown at half staff. I don't know for how long, but I did just drive across the Pennsylvania Turnpike yesterday and I saw them all. I don't know if it says in there or not.
No, I'm scrolling. It doesn't.
Might be a week, it might be a month, who knows? But they are at half staff. So there is some recognition, I guess, but how many people are going to notice flags on flagpoles and know what it's about? So just wanted to update that they did recognize it. He did release a statement. And in his statement, I think he indicated that maybe people are too numb to the sorrow anymore, which is a way to categorize it. But we are not going to cover that old ground already, which we did last week. So next empathy exercise.
This is a really exciting one and new ground to cover in a car. Hot Wheels has launched its first remote-controlled wheelchair toy in partnership with Paralympian athlete Wheels Fordingham, who was born with spina bifida and he's a motocross, a wheelchair motocross world champion.
Yeah. Go Aaron.
Go Aaron.
Go Aaron Wheels.
So excited that sports continues to allow people to see all of the broad skills their body can do, regardless of its perceived or actual limitations. And good on Hot Wheels. Great job for that. Mattel
I know. Mattel understands the assignment.
They really do. We saw the Mattel headquarters a lot because it's right by LAX. And so when my husband and I were recently out in Los Angeles at a board meeting, we drove by the Mattel thing a lot and I waved every single time. I was like, hello, inclusivity.
Keep up the good work.
Keep up the good work. Speaking of inclusivity.
Hey, what a transition. Our dear friends in Spain have been talking a little bit about having paid leave for menstrual pain, which, I mean, to all my sisters and misters out there who have menstrual pain, that's a pretty big freaking deal. So they're going to ease abortion limits for over 16s, but also allow menstrual leave, which is just groundbreaking. A little bit infuriating, but not so much when you spend as much time as we do understanding how the world works and how people think. And we all live in the world in 2022. So we know there's not, especially in the United States, there's not a lot of understanding of women's bodies and how they work and whether or not we should have consent or control over what happens in them. But I'm excited to know that I can just up and leave to Spain if I lose all my bodily autonomy. And if I have really bad cramps one day, I might be able to take the day off, which would be nice because, hopefully what this allows us to do and helps us to do is to see the myriad of ways that people's bodies inhibit their ability to be productive and that we can shift more towards a culture of rest and understanding. So folks that have light sensitivity or chronic pain or migraines or fibromyalgia or whatever, that we can move towards a more compassionate understanding of humans and their bodies and just say, if you don't feel well, take the day off. We'll figure it out. You know, we talk a lot about employee engagement and building a culture of empathy, like big ups to Spain for helping companies to build that culture of empathy by normalizing, recognizing menstrual pain. So excited about that. We're also excited to transition, now that we're done with our empathy exercises, to our nerd all caps cap discussion. That's not sci-fi. Sci-fi fantasy. We can talk about fantasy. I think we'll bring fantasy in probably.
We can bring like comic books are sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah,
and
they
everything
are.
Else.
They're
yeah.
both. Yeah. So, you know, last week we talked about COVID, which was real heavy lifting for us and for y'all. So we decided to do something fun this week, and we were like, you know what? Let's talk about sci-fi. I grew up in a household where my father and my brother were obsessed with sci-fi of lots of different varieties, mostly the Star Trek and the Star Wars varieties. But my dad read Ender's Game and Dune and all of those books. So we just kind of baked in it. We swam around in that soup my whole childhood. So I've had a love for sci-fi since the womb. And because of that, I've had to listen to conversations a lot about what sci-fi is and what sci-fi does and how it helps us build understanding. And I know all of the statistics about the original Star Trek series and the oft-cited fact that the first interracial kiss to ever happen on United States television happened on Star Trek between Captain James T. Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. So, you know, changing the game in how we understand, it doesn't even matter humans, like entities that exist. So we thought, what a fun way to talk about empathy through our love of sci-fi.
I grew up in a household that was just baked in reading more than anything else and baked in stories. But when the Star Wars, the first trilogy was re-released in the 90s, we went and I saw A New Hope for the very first time. Honestly, I saw it on the big screen.
That's cool.
I was right at that age where like my parents didn't own the VHS tapes. And so like they weren't huge people. Like they went to go see it originally when it was in the theaters and they remembered enjoying it.
Yeah.
But they didn't, you know, my parents read, my mom reads romance, my dad reads political thrillers. So, but they like Star Wars. And so we went as a family. I remember like vividly, we went as a family and it was as magical to me as the Disney cartoons. And as I grew up and I started reading a lot of G.K. Chesterton, who is a English writer from the early 20th century, early 1900s, who wrote this quote that I've thought about ever since whenever we talk about fantasy or fairy tales or sci-fi or comics. It's that you don't put the dragon in a story to tell children that dragons exist. You put them in a story to tell them that dragons can be defeated. And that at our core base, there's only about 3 stories we really tell. And we just tell them in a ton of ways. And I began to understand, especially as I went through youth work, my undergraduate work, my thought process was a lot around how to teach teenagers about truth through the use of myth. And I looked at Harry Potter and Narnia and Lord of the Rings. Those were the 3 I looked at because I was in college when the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out.
And the Harry Potter.
Early days. And I got to take a course in Lewis and Tolkien.
In the Narnia movies.
And the Narnia movies. It was all in the early aughts. Early aughts were a really great time for fantasy and a really great time for being. So for me, at the core of this entire discussion, what fantasy and sci-fi and fairy tales allow us to understand is pieces of humanity that don't seem as scary when we name them something else.
Yeah.
But that then we can relate to and understand our lives a little bit better. So if you think that this is silly, you're not watching our channel. But if you're ever kind of questioning,
sometimes we find some interesting folks who find us. That's true. You never know.
I was deeply reminded of this when Carrie Fisher died, and how many people talked about that Leia was their chief female role model growing up.
Yeah. That
she was the only strong woman they knew. Leia was how they understood what a woman in leadership could be. And I was lucky enough and blessed enough to be in a church where I saw women be pastors, and in schools where I saw women be principals. But I talked to some of my other friends that the very first time they ever saw a woman in power in real life was in graduate school.
Yeah.
And I began to understand the incredible power of Leia. And then as I grew up, I added Doctor Who to this. I added Star Trek to this. I am in no way, shape, or form a Trekkie. I enjoy it, but like my cousin Johnny is one. Shout out to John Daly. And he taught me a lot when we were growing up together. And I'm sure I was a jerk about it sometimes because I didn't understand it. And it seemed to my tendency when I think something isn't for me is to be really rude about it. Or when I don't understand something, to be really rude about it. So like I was a total jerk about chess for a really long time because it overwhelmed me. I was like, chess is so stupid. And really I felt too stupid to learn chess. So I'm sure I derided him at times when we were growing up, but I hope he knows now that I completely agree with him. But Doctor Who is one of mine that's really important. All of those. So to set up kind of why we understand this, let's talk about what kind of themes of humanity come through in Star Trek for you.
Yeah, so for me, like it's the core of what Star Trek is. And while you were talking, I was thinking about it, right? But it is like the core of empathy is understanding, right? That's what it is. But you can't get to empathy, you can't get to understanding without curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is literally what Starfleet is. Starfleet is like, we have the technology to explore all these places. Let us go forth in a peaceful mission into the universe and, seek out new galaxies, new destinations, new people, new things in a posture of learning and exploration. And I mean, that's what the mission of the Star Trek Enterprise was to just go out there as this ambassador, collect information, engage with different species on different planets, learn about I have visuals of watching like the original show and they beam down to a planet and Spock is like picking up plants and like learning about them and all this kind. So like it just, I think for me, that's what a sci-fi and fantasy did, especially to a very young me, was put me in a position to continue to be curious because I was watching all of these people be like, oh, this is so, and Star Wars is less about curiosity and more about politics than Star Trek was at the beginning. Star Trek certainly got into a lot of politics as the movies started coming out. But the focus of Star Wars was more about like
empire and
all that kind of stuff. But you do get,
it's a Christian allegory.
You get the ability to create circumstances that don't exist, as you said, just by saying like, this is now happening, on a foreign planet. And so we can have women in a position of leadership. Like, they had a Black captain on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. That was not something that had ever really happened. Then we had Captain Janeway on Star Trek Voyager. So like, you get to, with the freedom of sci-fi and fantasy comes the ability to imagine a different world. And then you can make it a world that you want it to be. Similarly to, what Schitt's Creek did. They just imagined a world without homophobia and they created it. So, but so much of that comes from sci-fi and fantasy in that if we can say that it's something else, we can have these conversations about that. So for me, I think that's what I got from my father and from my brother and from watching all of the Star Trek all the time was what happens when you're curious and what happens when you're not curious too. Because I think like the counter, especially in Star Trek, is like, if you're not willing to engage with people, if you're not willing to seek out new places, that's always the people that get into trouble or like they're always the example of what not to do. Yeah. If you're like, oh, well, this is just another alien race and they don't speak, we don't know how to communicate with them, so they're stupid or whatever. Like all the examples of times when people were being imperialist or being, you can't even call it like nationalist, but like
xenophobic. Yeah.
like xenophobic.
Yeah.
That was always the example of what not to do.
We need to say really briefly before I launch into like my main one that I learned a lot from is Doctor Who that I'd like to bring into this conversation is that even though it's fantasy, we've done a terrible job at representing people, at representing all the possibilities within fantasy. You don't see differently abled folks. And really, you don't see very rarely people of color. Star Wars very famously has a toxic as hell fandom that bullied Rosemarie Tran out of the fandom. That was terrible to John Boyega. So it boggles my mind, I'll just be really honest, that you can believe in like the Force and you can't believe that Black people can be Star Troopers, stormtroopers, but like that's a different.
Or that, like Black people can have the Force.
Like,
when we weren't sure what Finn was gonna be, and people were just like, "Well, he can't be a Jedi." I'm like,
the Force isn't real. Like
who? Samuel L. Jackson was a Jedi.
Come on now, Mace Windu. So anyway, we digress. But it's something like when I was nobody who looked like my body type is in fantasy. Carrie Fisher has talked a lot about Leia as a sexualized object, that the whole thing with Jabba the Hutt was so wrong to her that
so
she didn't have enough power to push back. And her mom, tried to teach her how to push back because Debbie Fisher was definitely also, Debbie Reynolds was also very abused for her body and hypersexualized. So, and Carrie, I heard her speak in public once and she's like, if I had the power I had now, she would have never been in the gold bikini.
Yeah.
Because the power of Leia was her brain. It wasn't her body.
And I think of like how she leveraged that before you get into Doctor Who, how she leveraged that into her appearance in the more recent movies and how she became like, I love that the impetus within the folks and creatively in charge of Star Wars, the impetus was to expand her role into like General Leia.
I love it. General Organa. Yep.
And that was like that, they said they took that, and I'm sure they took her feedback and her feelings about it, and they were like, cool, we're going to make you a general.
Yeah.
And we're going to bring in a lot of other women of different
and they
colors,
didn't do anything with them, which isn't great. And like,
it's like
this is like hot take. I think that George Lucas is an incredibly limited storyteller, and that is one of the reasons why the first 6 movies are so limited in how he could imagine like what people looked like. I think he can only tell one story really, and that's the story he can tell. So I really wish that like the prequels would have had other voices besides his in them, to be completely frank.
My family doesn't talk about the prequels.
Yeah. The only reason we're talking about the prequels right now in my family is that Brian, my brother, my husband, and I are all playing the Lego Skywalker saga. And you have to play the prequels to complete the game. So we're talking a lot about like, okay, well, what, like, this is insane. Like, why did they make this decision? And every once in a while I'll just put down that I was like, Star Wars would have been better if they brought in more people besides George Lucas. Like, that's just, he was really, really narrow. And so as much as the sale to Disney is controversial among fans, we have a friend who is a Star Wars devotee.
As I'd say, that's a aficionado.
That's
not strong enough.
No. It is her like worldview in a lot of it. Animating force
is Star Wars.
And she feels really, really sketchy about the Disney purchase, which is totally fair. But I think about, and especially I am disgusted how none of them defended Kelly or John, that the corporation didn't come out, and then all those kind of other things. So corporate garbage outside of the storytelling is always a problem. And I think I'm excited as to how wide the Star Wars universe is now getting. I for one am super excited. As we record this, Obi-Wan has not released yet as a series, and I am very excited for that one. We are Mandalorian lovers. So excited to kind of see the different people that can come in, because y'all know my favorite part of any fandom is the fan fiction.
Hey.
And honestly, Mandalorian is fan fiction, just commercially sanctioned fan fiction.
Yeah. And the Mando is such a great example of when Star Wars like expands its universe and steps outside of the confines of the Skywalker storyline and saga. What it can do. And
like, you created this giant world, go play.
And like the fact that they're starting to go play right now is really exciting. because they're making it accessible. Like you didn't know a lot about the context of The Mandalorian.
I knew zero
when you watched it, and I did, and there was maybe like 5 inside jokes that I got that she didn't get, and she like that's the thing that I love about, and you know, there's always a fine line to walk, and I think this will transition into our actual discussion of Doctor Who, because sometimes I feel really excluded watching Doctor Who because I don't know a lot of the lineage, and I jumped in with Jodie Whittaker because I love Jodie Whittaker and I was excited for a female doctor, and I watched the first season, and then by the second season I was like, ooh, y'all are in the weeds of this stuff, and I saw a lot of Whovians who were like happy about it, and look, they're making these references, and I was like, that's a lot of information. So I think finding a way to make it accessible, like the balancing act between keeping the fan base happy and making it accessible to new viewers is hard.
Yeah, and my perception of the Doctor Who fan base is that it's not really hella toxic anywhere but the UK. Like, it doesn't have an internationally toxic fan base the way that, I mean, we are not the only people to say that the Star Wars fan base is toxic.
Oh, absolutely not. No.
Star Wars, Buffy, Twilight, Supernatural are like the ones, and then there's a couple others that come to mind that like Eleanor and I talk about just in shorthand because we all know what an absolute shit show it was. The Onceler from the movie The Lorax, by the way, had a whole fandom drama on Tumblr. And if you are interested in that, please Google the Onceler Tumblr on YouTube and let Sarah Z tell you all about it, because humans can be toxic about anything, including an animated boy. But the thing I love about Doctor Who, I discovered Doctor Who the first time I lived in the UK in 2005. And by that point, it was pretty much in repeats, but they were talking about a reboot. And it was like everybody I knew was really excited about it. And so I had a friend who had some of the old VHSs, and we watched some of the Tom Baker years. And all I really, more than anything else, what I heard was his love of it and like his memories of it growing up. And how it used to be so scary. He would like hide behind the couch and like all these other things. And so then I ended up having surgery when I was living in Waco, and all of the David Tennant seasons were on Netflix. And like that was it. My mom flew down to help take care of me, and we watched all 4 seasons of Tennant in like a week and a half. And to this day, my mother like will ask me anytime she hears Doctor Who in the news, is David back? No, my mother watched all of Broadchurch because David Tennant was in it. Even after it like expired its prime stuff. But the basic lore behind Doctor Who is he is an alien from the planet Gallifrey, and he is the very last one. And it really is they are the very last one. And this alien race can regenerate into new bodies whenever it expires, which is the most genius decision you could make for a television show.
Right.
So we're about to hit our 15th Doctor? 14th Doctor?
Yeah.
14th Doctor since the 60s. Since the 50s and 60s, because it can just regenerate.
Yeah.
And for a long time, it was white dudes. And it was white British dudes. And then Jodie Whittaker was the first non-male, and now we have a non-white with Ncuti.
It's gone. It's gone for me
I'm not as familiar with his work as I was with Jodie's before her stuff. But I mean, David Tennant, like very famously, was a massive the Doctor Who fanboy.
Yeah.
And so he also brought that energy of like an encyclopedic knowledge of the entire show into his seasons.
Yeah.
And they
famously he married a daughter of a previous doctor.
Yes. Yeah.
So he was, I mean, I'm not saying that's why he married her.
No, I think Georgia was also probably a suitable wife.
I believe so, but still.
They have a parcel of children.
They have 85,000 children.
Yeah.
Not an exaggeration.
No. So, but the whole point of this is that then the doctor, which we don't know the name, it's just the Doctor, can travel through time and space and universes and memoriam and everything else and essentially fix things.
Yeah.
There are laws and limits. He can't intervene. They can't intervene in world wars. But they can do like bits of it. Like in one of the episodes that I love in the Tennant years, There were Cybermen from outer space that were going to invade London right in the middle of World War II. And they can essentially they can stop other planets interfering with you, but they can't stop you interfering with you.
Yeah.
And so like there are some, I appreciate a law. Fantasy always needs to tell us the rules. If you're going to tell us that the world is different, tell us how it's different. But the big thing with Doctor Who is that they were all obviously all played by humans. Like all of these creatures, none of them are CGI'd. They're all human. So in this very bizarre way, it was a really great reminder that different people are different. Mm-hmm. So like, yes, this thing that is presenting like an alien is still just at its core a human being. Or here are humans living in the year 4572 on planet whatever. And look, they have the exact same fears that I do. They have the exact same emotions that I do, all mixed up with just some really crazy, ridiculous villains. He flies around in a spaceship shaped like an old British post box. I mean, there's just some like really quirky British arcana. And during the Tennant years, I think they really transitioned well between the old stuff and the reboot. And then once we got into Matt Smith, who was the next one, I didn't love that as much because it brought in too much of the mythology and like the massiveness. I like the one-offs. And this is a little bit of like an X-Files thing. We are not X-Files people, but X-Files people tend to be divided between who loves the mythology episodes and who loves the bottle ones. Right. So as a Doctor Who fan, I like the bottle episodes more than I like the mythology episodes. That's just my particular bang. But I have a bracelet, actually, like one of those Alex and Ani knockoffs that has a TARDIS on it, which is the spaceship. And it says, "We're all just stories in the end. Make sure yours is a good one." Yeah. And that's really what Who is kind of sharing. David Tennant's Doctor 10 he's the 10th Doctor. So 10 is in love with libraries because libraries are the greatest power in the universe. The animating feature of Doctor Who is the power of story and how incredibly important it is to know other stories. So if the animating feature of Star Trek is curiosity, Doctor Who's is storytelling, Star Wars is defeating an empire. I would say Narnia's again is finding home and like how to define home and belonging. Narnia's animating feature is belonging. And Lord of the Rings animating feature is justice in a way. Yeah,
it's like good versus evil. Yeah. But also what I love so much about sci-fi and fantasy is it gives us the ability to have unlikely heroes.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And so for me, that when I think about Lord of the Rings, which was also massive in my household, the number of times I have seen the 1977 animated version of The Hobbit.
God bless you.
I can sing you all the songs, folks, all the songs, because it was an animated musical version. The best.
Just a reminder that The Hobbit is a children's book and making it into 3 movies was a disgusting cash grab. Please.
It's terrible.
It's just a children's book.
We don't talk about it. I don't even think I saw the 3rd Hobbit movie. I was so upset. But yeah, I mean, you know, the power of friendship too, and fellowship.
Community. Yeah. Isolation to community is a major theme.
Massive in more The Lord of the Rings than in The Hobbit. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about like one of the beautiful things that sci-fi and fantasy does is brings that sense of community and comradeship and shared interests to all these disparate people around the world. And like you go to Disney and you're in Star Wars and there's people from all over the world who have the same love of Star Wars or a similar love of Star Wars to you. And that's the beauty of any kind of like large scale entity like this is the ability to show us something about ourselves, show us that we're relatable, that we can relate to all different kinds of creatures, that then hopefully means all different kinds of humans, especially if they behave similarly to us. I mean, I think both in Star Wars and in Star Trek, it's the engagement with like alien races that teaches, specifically I'm thinking Star Trek because theirs is an educational adventure, teaches them about themselves and how to be better humans and how to be better participants in the universe.
Which Star Wars is not interested in.
Not so much. That's not the focus. But yeah, and you know, the necessity of fellowship and friendship, and finding understanding. I mean, that's such a huge part of the Who lore.
Oh my gosh,
is you know, the support that the Doctor always needs from their companions. But also, like, even I just watched one season, y'all, and I just know how much Jodie Whittaker's Doctor was like all about empathy and understanding, and we're all a part of this experience, and we have to help each other. So yeah, I think those are some of the other animating forces. But I think, yeah, you know, sci-fi is about curiosity. It's about community, storytelling.
Defeat of empire, like the defeat of evil.
Yeah, good over evil.
Defeat of evil. And bringing out unlikely things in yourself. Like, because when I think about comic book heroes, especially
emotional intelligence,
like Tony Stark's arc in all of the comics and definitely in the MCU was isolation to community.
Yeah.
And Cap's journey was from stubbornness to understanding. And kind of
literal frozen isolation to community.
You know, part of as we move into the MCU, you know, extended universe, like that's what, you know, Wanda's grief is a communal grief, you know, all of those kind of things. So a lot of it is about that, but the, you know, all the DC characters are all about that too, just because we don't talk about the DC characters because I just don't like them as much around here. Like Batman is fundamentally a crime fighter, who we believe gets to fight. Like he's a detective who just also happens to love gadgets. But the whole thing is about good versus evil, and how, and evil is anybody who exploits the under-resourced. Evil is exploitation. And how do we look like? How do we do that kind of thing? So there's lots and lots of available tales. And there's lots of comic books out there. Like the Saga tale, we didn't really talk about Dune. There's lots and lots of these beautiful things. There's some really destructive ones too. I mean, people can talk to you all about Ender's Game and how toxic it is. And there's a lot of problems with Brandon Sanderson's books, and a lot of problems with Robert Jordan's books, and then at the base of it, the stories are still the stories. We can talk for hours about the good and the bad in Harry Potter, and that Harry Potter gave us some really, really beautiful lessons and empowered an entire generation of people to read. And the more you read, the more empathetic you become, and the more we write stories about different people. And, you know, it's a reflection of the creator. It's possibly anti-Semitic, and the creator is very transphobic. There's not any sort of disability rep or queer rep or body shape rep. They're not clear about racial differences in the books. And so the movies reflect the prejudices of the casting directors. There's lots of problems, but all of our faves are problematic. And that doesn't mean that we can't learn lessons from them. So that's one of the other core lessons about empathy in sci-fi, fantasy, and comic book world, is that just because something itches you doesn't mean it can't teach you something about humanity that you can use to deepen the way that you human.
Yeah, and I think too, it's the importance of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? And saying like, what can we, you know, it's important to engage critically with art.
Yeah, always.
It's important to have conversations about art and its failings. That's why we have a YouTube channel, because we like to talk about what we learn from art and what it does and does not do well. There is no piece of art that is perfect or whole for anyone. And so, but I think that's the other lesson we can get from sci-fi from this, is that like different people are different and different people like different things. And as my brother so wisely said on our YouTube channel so long ago, everybody's a nerd about something. And so the best sci-fi and the best fantasy, it is the most inclusive in terms of who it brings in to enjoy it.
Yeah.
But everything is going to have problems. Because, spoiler alert, the people creating the art are not alien races, they're humans. So you have to I think, kind of grow into that understanding. There were times in my life where I would have been a lot more like cut direct about things and been like, no, I can't handle the creator of Harry Potter, so I can't do Harry Potter anymore. But now I'm like, you know what? It was written in its time. It was written by a person. It was casted by people. Let's just take what we can out of it, and have discussions. I mean, we love to talk about this stuff, so that's why we're here. And we've so far got a good solid half an hour easily just having a chit chat off the top of our heads. So that's the other beauty of them, is that they foster, through community, they foster conversation and understanding.
And so that's where we'll hit pause today. Our hope for you is that you do, in fact, have a fandom, whether it's for sports or it's for crafting or it's for sci-fi, in a way that teaches you new ways to human through something that brings you joy, in a way that shows you different perspectives through something that gives you home and calm at the same time. And if you are watching this and joining us for the first time, welcome. We're delighted to have you. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and engage in all of our stuff. In the downstairs is all the links to the empathy exercises, as well as a place to sign up for our newsletter. And a gentle reminder that if you're into seeing the world a little bit differently, join us on June the 1st at noon for an online training we're doing around language and how to understand how to use language to help people and not to hurt people. And it's called Words We Don't Say Anymore. And we'd love to have a chat with you about that. And the link to buy your ticket for that is also in the downstairs. However you joined us today, we hope that you find yourself well on the other end of this. And as the COVID spikes again, we'll say that may your tests be negative, may your Wi-Fi be strong, and may the odds be ever in your favor.
Speaking of another fantasy nerd category.
Indeed.
Right. Slipped it right in there. And then sneaky. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
You and me and Jay.
Why won't it end? StreamYard, end the broadcast. It's okay.